They fought under a black flag and called themselves an army without generals. Yesterday's peasants, deserters, adventurers of all kinds, all of them gathered around the charismatic Batka and decided to build a republic without a state. Their allies would be the Reds or the Whites in turn, but they never trusted anyone for long. Their enemies considered them bandits, while their supporters saw them as freedom fighters. The Makhnovists had neither strict uniforms nor parades, but they did have a tachanka with a machine gun and faith in their own order. Welcome to the History Show channel and the section How Zili is Announced Open. Let's begin. Where did the Makhnovists originate? The story of the Makhnovists begins, as it should, with a person. Nestor Ivanovich Makhno was born in the village of Upheaval in 1888. He lost his father early, grew up in poverty, worked for landlords since childhood, and quickly realized that life isn't about justice, but about hard work. While young, he joined the local anarchist group, the Union of Free Grain Growers, and soon voluntarily landed in prison. Makhno spent 6 years in Butyrka prison and came out not just as a peasant, but as a committed revolutionary. In his cell, he read history and politics books and became convinced all authority is evil. Now about the political background. In 1917, the country turned into a real boiling cauldron. In Petrograd, the provisional government claimed to rule the Russian Empire, while in Kiev, the Central Rada was sure it governed Ukraine. Then, in November, the provisional government was overthrown by the Bolsheviks, who were now sure that they should be in charge. And in the south of Ukraine, German and Austro-Hungarian troops were already marching in, having been invited to restore order. In the end, it turned out like in that joke, there are plenty of bosses, but no real business to run. Makhno saw this whole mess in his own way. Foreign armies were invaders, the Central Rada were traitors, the Bolsheviks were temporary allies, but also unreliable. While politicians negotiated Ukraine's future, Nestor gathered fellow peasants in his village, preparing to seize land and estates from landlords. It was then that they started calling him Batko, because he could both protect and lead them. That's how the army appeared. Officially called the Revolutionary Insurgent Army of Ukraine, and unofficially known as the Makhnovists. The ideology was a free republic, if we believe Makhno himself and his supporters. There should be no authority at all, no Tsar, no Hetman, no Commissars, no one at all. Instead of a state, there should be councils of peasants and workers who make their own decisions. The Makhnovists had an anarchist slogan on their flags: "Anarchy is the mother of order." The wording sounded paradoxical, but the idea was simple. Order is born not from commands from above, but from people reaching agreements among themselves. Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan, in Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan, in Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan, in Kazakhstan, in Kazakhstan, in Kazakhstan, in Kazakhstan. Vivcharayan functioned unacceptably. This did not exist, and the deciding match was Gaskat. According to the rules, no?
Kala.
The wording sounded paradoxical, but the essence is simple. Order is not born from orders from above, but from what people agree upon among themselves. The Makhnovists had their own form of anarchy regarding money. Initially, they wanted to eliminate it, but realized they couldn't manage without paper bills. They didn't print their own full-fledged currency. In Upheaval, they used whatever came to hand. Tsarist rubles, Soviet sovsnaks, Ukrainian banknotes, and even sometimes German marks. The Makhnovists sometimes stamped these bills with their seals or added handwritten jokes like "Anarchy is the mother of order." For example, whoever refuses this money, Makhno will handle them. There were also some obscene jokes. It turned out to be a kind of humorous currency, which nevertheless was accepted at the market. A key aspect was the stance on nationality and religion. Unlike Soviet films, which depicted Makhno's men as drunken, lawless thugs, in reality, Makhno himself was categorically against anti-Semitic incidents. He even personally suppressed such cases and punished the instigators. As for the church, the movement had no official position, but religion was seen more as a personal matter rather than the foundation of society. The ideology of the Makhnovists seemed both simple and utopian. On one hand, it was the honest dream of the peasants, to live on their own without bosses. On the other hand, it was an absolute rejection of any state. The only problem was that the surrounding world was not going to adapt to these ideals. While the Makhnovists were fighting, anarchy thrived. But as soon as they left, a new authority would come in with its own orders and grain requisitioning. How many were there? Time. Exactly. Counting the Makhnovists is a futile task. Their army was too mobile, and its structure resembled a huge peasant work gang with machine guns more than regular units. However, I do have some numbers for you. The core of the army was made up of so-called shock units. That's about 5,000 to 8,000 fighters, mostly cavalry, machine gunners, and artillerymen. These were true daredevils, ex-soldiers, sailors, revolutionaries, and deserters skilled in fighting and unafraid of risk. They moved around on tachankas, light four-seater carts with machine guns, requisitioned from German colonists along with the horses. Makhno's men had several hundred of these carts. The tachankas became the real trademark, the brand of Makhno's army, and even battle-hardened white officers were afraid of them. Besides the elite, there was also a peasant militia. When a major raid or threat began, thousands of villagers joined Makhno, armed with whatever they could find. On paper, the headquarters could report up to 100,000 fighters. That was the number mentioned in 1919. In reality, most of these mobilized people were peasants who could come to fight and then go back home to work the land. This was both the strength and the weakness of the Makhnovist movement. Thus, the number of Makhnovists was constantly fluctuating. Today it could be a few hundred, tomorrow tens of thousands. At its peak in 1919, the army could have up to 50-60,000 active fighters. But at the same time, the real steel fist remained a few thousand experienced horsemen and machine gunners, who created the reputation of the Makhnovists as the main nightmare of the Civil War. How did they fight? The main secret of the Makhnovists' success was mobility and surprise. They didn't build fronts and trench lines like the Whites or the Reds. Their tactics were more like hunting, a sudden raid, a strike out of nowhere, and then a quick disappearance. The enemies had no time to determine if there were hundreds or thousands. Intelligence was crucial. And it wasn't just armed men. Women, teenagers, old people, all could be the eyes and ears of the Makhnovists. That's why they were almost impossible to catch in their own region. Every village knew who was traveling on the road and passed the information to headquarters in time. Their tactics relied on commanders' flexibility, who were chosen by the fighters, not appointed from above. This meant a commander couldn't afford incompetence. Losing authority meant he would simply be removed. This approach allowed them to quickly change strategy and avoid getting bogged down in bureaucracy. The Makhnovists were versatile with their enemies. They fought against the Whites, the Reds, the Petlarists, and German units. Alliances were made situationally, today with the Bolsheviks against Denikin, tomorrow already against the Bolsheviks themselves. This tactic of constantly shifting alliances allowed the Makhnovists to survive longer than many much more organized armies. Combat operations were mainly carried out behind enemy lines. The Makhnovists attacked depots, communications, and railway junctions. Their favorite tactic was to strike at the supply line and then disappear into the steppe. The regular armies hated the Makhnovists because they knew how to strike hard and never gave a chance for a direct battle. But the Makhnovists always had a constant problem with weapons. The Free Republic didn't have its own industry, so they had to take everything from others. The main sources were trophies taken after battles with the Whites, the Reds, or German units. The second way was alliances with the Bolsheviks. When it was beneficial for them, they supplied the Makhnovists with cartridges and weapons so they could fight the Whites. But as soon as the common enemy was defeated, the supplies stopped. That's why the Makhnovists' arsenal was extremely diverse. Some had moose and rifles, some had captured Austrian Mannlichers, and some had old revolvers or even hunting shotguns. Maxims, machine guns, and artillery were often captured in battles. How did they live and what did they eat? Makhno's army was not regular, so there was no standard army ration here. Everything was based on voluntarism and the support of the peasants. After a raid, fighters usually returned home, and for campaigns, they brought simple, reliable food like bread, boiled eggs, sallow, and sausage. Such a Makhno fighter's backpack fit into a knapsack and could be stored for a long time. The main product was bread. Unlike in Soviet and White territories, there was no food requisitioning in the Free Republic. Makhno did not tolerate commissars or requisition squads. That's why the peasants shared their grain more willingly. Bread was supplied voluntarily, not at gunpoint. Along with bread, there were potatoes, cottage cheese pancakes, brinza cheese milk, everything that the village produced. When the detachments entered friendly villages, they were treated to homemade products. Someone had an extra sack of potatoes, someone else had a cow that gave milk. Sometimes the Makhnovists were even fed with ready-made dishes because the peasants considered them their protectors. Meat was harder to come by. Pork and sausage were available, but on the march, they usually made do with sallow. It's filling and doesn't spoil, and if they had to go on a long raid, they would take smoked meats and dried bread with them. Alcohol is a separate topic. Soviet propaganda depicted the Makhnovists as always drunk, but in fact, constant drinking was impossible. How could you ride or raid for hours with a hangover? According to memoirs, they could only drink after a successful raid or in a village where they celebrated a victory. Usually it was just small amounts of homemade pepper vodka. But it wasn't a perfect picture either. The army attracted deserters and criminals who often lacked discipline and looted. They didn't stay long, as violations in the Makhno ranks were punished harshly. Overall, the food of the Makhno fighters was almost no different from that of the peasants: bread, potatoes, dairy products, and lard. The only difference was that all of this had to be adapted to life on the move. They had to take what could be stored for a long time and what would quickly satisfy hunger. Inner life. Makhnovist discipline relied on collective responsibility, not regulations. Each commander was accountable for his unit's actions, including looting or pogroms. This created a rather strict system of control, even without the usual military orders. Their approach to mobilization was unique. Unlike the Reds or Whites, the Makhnovists relied on voluntary enlistment instead of forcing people to join. A village assembly would gather and decide whether to help Makhno or not. Formally, participation seemed voluntary, but in wartime, refusal left the village unprotected. That's why most people agreed anyway. Revolutionary councils, which operated in the rear, were just as important. They handled economic issues, divided land, supplied the units, and helped with horses and food. In essence, it was an attempt to build a small self-governing society without officials and bureaucracy. Thus, in Makhno's army, freedom and order were combined. People elected their leaders and made decisions at gatherings, but at the same time, for breaking the rules, they could be expelled or even executed. This was the uniqueness of Makhno, anarchists in words, but in practice, strict discipline. Where did they disappear to? The end of the Makhno project came right after their moment of glory. In the fall of 1920, Makhno, acting together with units of the Red Army, helped break through Wrangel's defenses. On the night of November 8, his cavalry crossed the Sivash, bypassed the Perekop fortifications, and the White defenses collapsed. By November 15, Wrangel's command had evacuated troops from Crimea. Then there's the classic case of convenient alliances. As soon as the main enemy was defeated, the Makhnovists became unnecessary. On November 23, 1920, the Southern Front Command demanded full integration into the Red Army and an end to Huliepol's self-government. Makhno refused, after which the Reds immediately began a purge, including the arrest and execution of his closest associates. By 1921, Makhno's remaining forces were still evading raids in southern Ukraine, but their resources were depleted. They faced opposition from the army, the Cheka, informants, and a weary population. By the end of summer, Nestor was pressed against the Romanian border. He decided to cross the Nestor and surrender to the Romanian authorities. After that, emigration and death in Paris in 1934 in poverty and illness. Why did everything fall apart at that time? Besides the military pressure, the Bolsheviks' economy changed. The food requisitioning was replaced by a food tax, and the number of dissatisfied peasants decreased. Without broad peasant support, the freedom fighters lost their footing, and the Makhnovist movement, like other insurgent movements, began to decline. And yes, the Bolshevik tactic of using and then destroying played out in full force here. An alliance against a common enemy, and then declaring the Makhnovists outlaws and systematically hunting them down. Their disappearance happened exactly according to this scenario. Epilogue. So the story of the Makhnovists is an example of how the peasant dream of freedom turned into a nightmare for everyone who tried to impose order from above. They built their own free republic, dividing the land among themselves. Commanders were elected at the assembly and commissars were kept away from them. But in reality, this only worked as long as there wasn't a bigger army nearby. The Bolsheviks, the Whites, the Central Rada, the Germans, all of them considered the Makhnovists either temporary allies or bandits getting in the way of big politics. In the end, the Makhnovshchina disappeared just as suddenly as it had appeared. And yet the legend remained. For some, Makhno is a tachanka-riding bandit, for others, a hero defending the peasants. But his movement showed the main thing: no power can hold on if it ignores the people. This, perhaps, is the main paradox. Anarchy is the mother of order. It was under this slogan that people tried to bring order to their own villages themselves, while the big armies were playing their revolutions. That's all from me. Goodbye, everyone.